When we imagine sleep today, we picture electricity humming in the background, alarm clocks on the nightstand, and the goal of a solid 8 uninterrupted hours of rest. But in the medieval world, sleep was a very different experience. Night itself was not simply a time of rest, but a realm of uncertainty, vulnerability, and mystery. In the absence of artificial light, darkness ruled the landscape. Candles were expensive, firewood was precious, and so the natural rhythms of the sun dictated when people lay down and when they stirred. Unlike us, medieval men and women did not usually expect to fall into one long continuous slumber. Instead, they often followed what we now call segmented sleep. 2 distinct stretches of rest broken by an hour or 2 of wakefulness in the middle of the night. After a first sleep, people might rise quietly, stoke the hearth, tend to animals, read prayers, or even visit a neighbor. Then, after this strange twilight interlude, they would return to their beds for their second sleep, often until dawn. Far from being considered insomnia, this rhythm was simply normal, a habit shaped by environment and necessity. Writers such as Chaucer and other chroniclers of the Middle Ages confirm this pattern, showing us that our modern idea of an unbroken 8-hour block is actually a relatively recent invention born in the age of factories and electric lamps. The beds on which medieval people rested also varied dramatically depending on wealth and social class. For peasants, a bed was little more than a straw-filled sack or a pile of hay spread on the ground. Sometimes, if fortune allowed, it would be raised slightly on a crude wooden frame, but just as often it was nothing more than a pallet directly on the floor. Dampness seeped through, insects burrowed within, and field mice often made their nests in the straw. Sleeping in such conditions was hardly comfortable, and pests like lice, fleas, and bedbugs were constant companions. In contrast, nobles could enjoy beds that were among the most valuable items in their households. Wooden-framed constructions with feather mattresses, fine linens, embroidered coverings, and ornate canopies that displayed wealth as much as they provided rest. These beds were so prized that they were sometimes listed in wills as inheritable property. Nightwear was equally practical. Peasants usually slept in their day clothes, with little distinction between working garments and sleeping ones, while the wealthy might own long night shirts or tunics. A particularly iconic item was the nightcap, a wool or linen hat worn to keep the head warm in drafty, uninsulated homes. Far from being a quaint accessory, it was an essential part of sleepwear, sometimes even reflecting social rank through the quality of fabric and decoration. Privacy, as we understand it, was almost non-existent in the medieval bedchamber. Families often slept crowded together in a single space, parents with children, sometimes joined by extended kin or even neighbors. In inns, the situation could be even more startling to modern sensibilities. Travelers frequently shared beds with strangers, packed into rooms with multiple sleepers and virtually no expectation of solitude. In the countryside, it was also common for peasants to share their sleeping quarters with animals. Dogs, pigs, or chickens brought indoors, not out of affection but for warmth. A dog might curl at the feet of its master, while livestock huddled nearby to lend their body heat to a freezing room. To a modern mind, this seems unhygienic, but for many it was the difference between surviving winter nights and shivering through the dark. Even nobles, though they kept livestock outside, often allowed lapdogs or favored pets into their chambers. Security was another concern. Travelers, fearful of theft, would often sleep with their valuables tied to their belts or tucked beneath their bodies, while knights and soldiers might keep weapons close at hand, ready for danger even in slumber. For monks and religious communities, the act of sleeping was treated not as comfort but as discipline. In monasteries, rows of brothers lay in cold communal dormitories, often upon nothing more than wooden planks or the thinnest of straw mattresses. Pillows were considered luxuries, curtains indulgent distractions, and silence was strictly enforced. To speak in the dormitory could be punishable, for the night hours were meant for quiet reflection and rest under the watchful eye of God. Around 2 in the morning, monks would be roused by the tolling of bells for matins, rising from their hard beds to gather in candlelit chapels and chant prayers that could last for hours. Sleep in this context was not primarily for the body's restoration, but for spiritual discipline, another arena in which the soul could be trained. Some ascetic monks even forced themselves to sleep sitting up, both to avoid the temptation of luxurious comfort and to prevent sinful dreams. For ordinary laypeople too, the spiritual dimension of sleep was ever present. Nightfall brought real fears, of demons, of sudden death, of illness, or of the devil's whispers. Bedtime prayers and confessions were common, as if each night's rest might be the last before judgment. Dreams, meanwhile, were taken very seriously. They could be divine messages, warnings, or demonic tricks. Theologians and priests sometimes interpreted them, and ordinary people recorded them with curiosity or dread. The medieval night then was not only physical darkness but also a spiritual landscape, charged with meaning and mystery. Finally, it is worth remembering that sleep in the medieval world was constantly beset by discomforts and dangers that we scarcely imagine today. Fleas and lice were universal irritants, gnawing at skin and disturbing slumber. Servants in wealthy households were sometimes employed as nitpickers, tasked with combing out lice from their lord's hair and clothing. Remedies ranged from placing garlic or ashes in the bed to burning herbs to drive pests away. Though none were fully effective, nightcaps and long tunics also served as barriers against the bites of crawling insects. Beyond the pests there was noise, the clanging of church bells, the cries of animals, the rumble of storms, or even the sound of distant conflict. Yet despite all this, medieval people slept on. Sleep was a form of escape from hardship, grief, or hunger, a fragile refuge in a world of ceaseless toil and uncertainty. To us, their nights may seem grim, but to them, the rituals of rest, whether in straw pallets or feather mattresses, surrounded by family or fellow monks, whispering prayers into the dark, were as natural and essential as breathing itself. Their nights remind us that sleep is not a fixed human constant, but a practice deeply shaped by culture, necessity, and belief. In the year 1692, the small Puritan settlement of Salem, Massachusetts, became the stage for one of the darkest and most infamous episodes in early American history. The Salem Witch Trials. Life in Salem was already strained before the first whispers of witchcraft began. The community was divided by property disputes, personal grudges, and tensions between families of differing social status. The harsh New England winter, crop failures, and threats from Native American tribes on the frontier compounded the unease. Puritan society itself was built on fear, the fear of sin, of God's wrath, and of the ever-present devil said to be lurking in the shadows. Against this backdrop of anxiety and instability, the strange behavior of a few young girls ignited a wildfire that would consume the town. Reverend Samuel Parris's daughter Betty and his niece Abigail began to convulse, scream, and claim unseen forces were tormenting them. Local doctors, failing to find any physical cause, reached a conclusion that fit neatly into Puritan beliefs. The girls must be bewitched. What began as a curious medical puzzle quickly turned into a spiritual crisis. The accusations spread like sparks in dry grass. The first to be accused were the socially vulnerable. Women on the margins of Salem society such as Sarah Good, a poor beggar, Sarah Osborne, who rarely attended church, and Tituba, Reverend Parris's enslaved servant of Caribbean origin. Under pressure, Tituba confessed, not freely, but likely to save herself from harsher punishment. Her confession unleashed a terrifying new dimension. She claimed that Satan's servants were active in Salem, and more witches were at work. This gave credibility to the girls' stories and encouraged further accusations. Soon, the hysteria spiraled beyond control. Children pointed fingers at neighbors, friends accused one another, and grudges found new weapons in the form of supernatural charges. The courts began to rely on spectral evidence, testimony that the spirit or ghost of the accused had appeared to the victim in dreams or visions. By modern legal standards, this was absurd, but in Salem's world, it was seen as proof enough. Once accused, a person had little chance of escape. Denials were often taken as evidence of deeper guilt, while confessions, however forced, might spare the accused from execution, but left them branded for life. Public trials became grim spectacles. Crowds gathered as neighbors testified against one another, recounting bizarre stories of livestock dying, butter spoiling, or mysterious illnesses that were blamed on witchcraft. Judges and ministers sat in solemn authority, convinced they were waging a righteous battle against the devil's army. In truth, they were presiding over a miscarriage of justice fueled by fear and suspicion. The accused were shackled, interrogated harshly, and often humiliated before their communities. Some broke under pressure and admitted to impossible acts, flying through the night, consorting with demons. Confessions extracted not because they were true, but because the alternative was the gallows. In all, more than 200 people were accused. 19 were hanged on Gallows Hill, and one man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death with heavy stones after refusing to enter a plea. Others languished and died in overcrowded jails. The victims were not just the marginalized. Eventually, respected citizens like Rebecca Nurse, a pious elderly woman, were condemned. The madness had consumed not only Salem's outcasts but also its pillars. As the summer of 1692 wore on, the frenzy began to show cracks. Accusations reached higher and higher up the social ladder, ensnaring even the wife of Governor William Phips. Suddenly, the ruling class realized that if the trials continued unchecked, no one, no matter how wealthy or pious, would be safe. By October, the special court of Oyer and Termine was disbanded. A new court was established, one that rejected spectral evidence. Without it, the flood of accusations dried up and many prisoners were released. By the following spring, the hysteria had largely passed, leaving behind a community shattered by grief, guilt, and mistrust. Families mourned the loss of loved ones executed for crimes they never committed. Survivors carried the stain of false confessions or wrongful imprisonment. The authorities, once so zealous, now expressed public remorse. Judges and ministers admitted their errors, and the colony declared days of fasting and repentance to atone for the injustice. In later years, some restitution was made to the families of the victims, but no amount of money or apology could undo the trauma. The legacy of the Salem Witch Trials endures as both a warning and a mirror. It reveals how quickly fear can corrode justice, how superstition and social tension can combine to produce deadly outcomes, and how fragile the rule of law becomes when extraordinary evidence is allowed to replace reason. Salem became a symbol of hysteria, invoked in later centuries whenever societies were tempted to scapegoat the vulnerable or sacrifice fairness for security. From McCarthyism in the 1950s to modern debates over mass suspicion and conspiracy theories, echoes of Salem continue to resurface. At its heart, the tragedy of Salem was not merely about witches, but about people. Frightened children, ambitious neighbors, flawed leaders, and innocent victims caught in a storm of fear. To walk through the story of Salem is to confront one of humanity's recurring dangers, the way panic can turn communities against themselves, and the way justice, once compromised, leaves scars for generations.
In the violent and unpredictable politics of late Republican Rome, women were expected to remain in the shadows, confined to the private world of family and household. Yet into this turbulent stage stepped Fulvia, a woman who defied convention and carved out a role as one of the most politically active women of her age. Born around 83 BCE into a wealthy plebeian family with strong political connections, she inherited both status and ambition. Unlike most Roman women, who were expected to wield influence only indirectly through their husbands or sons, Fulvia entered public life with a boldness that shocked contemporaries. Her 3 marriages, first to Publius Clodius Pulcher, then to Gaius Scribonius Curio, and finally to Mark Antony, placed her at the center of Rome's most dangerous power struggles. Each time she was widowed, it was due not to domestic misfortune but to the ceaseless churn of civil wars and factional violence that consumed Rome. Yet Fulvia did not shrink from these losses. Instead, she used each marriage as a stepping stone, building alliances, securing influence, and ensuring her voice was heard in the streets and in the Senate's back rooms. Fulvia's first husband, Clodius Pulcher, was notorious for his populist tactics and street gangs that terrorized Rome's political opponents. Far from being a passive bystander, Fulvia was deeply involved in his career. When Clodius was murdered in 52 BCE, it was Fulvia who stood before the crowd, displaying his wounded body and stirring public outrage. This act alone revealed her unusual political instinct. She understood the power of spectacle and emotion in Roman politics. Her second marriage, to Curio, kept her within the circle of populist leaders until his death in battle. But it was her third marriage, to Mark Antony, that secured her place in history. With Antony, she became not just a partner but a political strategist, managing his affairs in Rome while he campaigned abroad. Ancient coins even bore her likeness alongside Antony's, a rare honor that symbolized her unprecedented visibility in public life. Roman historians, writing from the perspective of a deeply patriarchal society, often painted Fulvia as domineering, overbearing, or unfeminine. But their criticisms, couched in misogyny, testify to the scale of her influence. She was a woman who dared to act like a man in the political sphere, and that made her both remarkable and threatening.
Her most audacious moment came in 41 BCE during the Perusian War, a rebellion against Octavian, the future Augustus. While Antony was occupied in the east and increasingly entangled with Cleopatra, Fulvia and Antony's brother Lucius Antonius took up arms against Octavian in Italy. The conflict was sparked by disputes over land distribution to veterans, but beneath it lay deeper rivalries between Antony's faction and Octavian's growing power. Fulvia was no mere figurehead. Ancient sources suggest she personally rallied troops, negotiated with allies, and inspired resistance against Octavian's forces. For a Roman woman to step so openly into the role of military and political leader was virtually unheard of. Although the rebellion ultimately failed and ended with the siege of Perusia, Fulvia's courage and determination marked her as a unique figure in Roman history. Lucius Antonius was spared, but Fulvia herself was forced into exile in the Greek city of Sicyon. It was there, far from Rome's political stage, that her health collapsed. She died in 40 BCE, worn down by stress, illness, and perhaps heartbreak over Antony's shifting loyalties. In death, Fulvia's reputation fared little better than her rebellion. Roman historians, eager to justify Octavian's eventual rise to power, painted her as a meddlesome woman whose ambition brought ruin. They accused her of jealousy, of stirring war out of spite against Cleopatra, of driving Antony into reckless conflict. In their accounts, Fulvia became a cautionary tale, the disruptive woman who overstepped her gender's bounds and plunged Rome into civil strife. Yet when we read between the lines, a different image emerges. Fulvia was not a petty schemer but a woman who navigated the brutal world of Roman politics with extraordinary skill. She leveraged her marriages into real influence, stood defiantly in public life, and fought for her family's faction when others would have retreated into silence. Modern historians have begun to recognize her as a pioneer, one of the earliest Roman women to wield political power so openly. Fulvia's story reminds us of the cost of challenging societal expectations. Her boldness won her influence, but also ensured her vilification in history books written by men who could not accept her defiance of traditional gender roles. Yet she foreshadowed the prominence of later Roman women such as Livia, Agrippina, and of course Cleopatra, figures who would shape the empire from behind the scenes or in defiance of convention. Fulvia, though less remembered, deserves her place among them as a trailblazer, who showed that even in a world designed to silence women, determination and courage could carve out a voice. She may have died in exile, her rebellion defeated, but her legacy lives on as an enduring example of how power, when seized against the odds, can leave echoes far beyond its own time. By the early 1960s, the United States stood at a crossroads. Nearly a century had passed since the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, yet racial segregation and systemic oppression remained deeply entrenched. Especially in the American South, black citizens faced barriers at every turn. Discrimination in housing, unequal schools, job exclusions, and the daily indignity of Jim Crow laws that treated them as second class. At the same time, a rising civil rights movement had begun to push back with increasing strength. Sit-ins at segregated lunch counters, bus boycotts, student protests, and court victories had ignited a sense of momentum. But despite these efforts, progress was slow and violence was constant. Activists were beaten, jailed, and in some cases killed for daring to demand basic equality. Into this atmosphere came the idea of a mass demonstration in the nation's capital, one that would bring together thousands to demand jobs, freedom, and justice. It was not just about civil rights, it was about the soul of America itself. The march was the brainchild of veteran labor leader A. Philip Randolph, who had long envisioned a great demonstration to force the government's hand alongside him. Organizer Bayard Rustin and a coalition of civil rights groups crafted a plan of staggering ambition. The logistics were immense, coordinating buses, trains, food, medical aid, security, and sound systems for what would become one of the largest peaceful gatherings in American history. On August 28, 1963, more than 250,000 people flooded into Washington, D.C. They came by every means imaginable. Cars, trains, church buses, and even on foot. Ordinary people united by a shared demand for dignity. The marchers represented a wide spectrum. Students, union members, clergy, celebrities, and families, both black and white, who believed in the cause. Despite fears of unrest, the day unfolded with remarkable order. The mood was one of determination and hope, a mixture of solemn protest and joyful solidarity. Along the reflecting pool, bodies pressed together, banners waved, and voices rang out in hymns and chants. The program of the day reflected the breadth of the movement's demands. It was officially called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, emphasizing that the struggle was not just about ending segregation, but about economic justice. Speakers addressed housing inequality, unemployment, voting rights, and police brutality. Gospel singers and celebrities added their voices, and activists gave fiery speeches that resonated across the mall. Yet one moment would come to define the entire march, and indeed the entire civil rights era. When Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stepped to the podium at the Lincoln Memorial, his words rose beyond politics into poetry. In his "I Have a Dream" speech, King painted a vision of a future where children of all races would join hands, where freedom would roll down like waters, and where America would finally live up to its creed of liberty and justice for all. The crowd, already moved, erupted with cheers and tears. King's voice carried not just across the mall, but across television screens into homes nationwide, etching itself into history as one of the most iconic speeches ever delivered. The impact of the march was immediate and lasting. Media coverage, though sometimes cautious, could not ignore the sight of 250,000 citizens gathered peacefully for justice. The Kennedy administration, wary of unrest, now recognized the urgency of civil rights legislation. Within a year, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, outlawing segregation in public spaces and banning employment discrimination. Soon after, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 followed, dismantling barriers that had long suppressed black political power. But beyond the laws, the march reshaped the narrative of America's moral conscience. It showed that disciplined, nonviolent mass protest could capture the world's attention and move governments to act. For Dr. King, the march elevated him to global prominence, though it also drew intensified surveillance and hostility from the FBI, which feared his growing influence. For the movement as a whole, the march was proof that unity and determination could turn a dream into tangible change. Yet the march was not without its silences. Women, who played critical roles in organizing and sustaining the civil rights struggle, were largely sidelined from speaking roles on the stage. Behind the scenes, figures like Dorothy Height and Ella Baker worked tirelessly, but their voices were overshadowed by male leaders. This omission reminds us that even within movements for justice, inequality can persist. Still, the symbolism of the day endures. The March on Washington remains a touchstone not just for the civil rights era, but for every generation that has since taken to the streets to demand justice, from anti-war protests to the Black Lives Matter movement. Its legacy is both inspiring and unfinished. Many of the original demands, fair housing, full employment, an end to police brutality, remain struggles in modern America. But the vision King articulated continues to resonate, a reminder that history bends only when people bend it through collective action. The march stands as a testament that ordinary people, united by hope, can gather in the shadow of monuments and with one voice call a nation to account.